Hey everybody, just want to welcome everyone to this review session. It looks like we're going to have a pretty small session today. If during this session, because it's a live session, if you have any questions, just feel free to type out your questions and I'll answer them as best as I can. If you have any questions even after this session, feel free to email me if you need clarification on anything, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Basically, the format of this session is going to be like this. Basically, I'm going to go through the basic instructions as to what I expect in your answer, and then we're going to go through basically the exam. If this is going to be the exam, there's not going to be any changes. This is it. This is the exam. If you guys haven't downloaded the questions already, they're immediately below the link to this Blackboard session. And if you haven't already, that's fine. We're going to go through each question anyway. You can do that at a later time. The link to submit your exam will be posted tomorrow, and it will be made available all the way to Saturday, so you should have any problems. And if you have any problems submitting it using that link, just email it to me. I'm perfectly fine with that. I think we've experienced already enough technical difficulties in this course that we should be as flexible, or at least I should be as flexible as possible. So without further ado, let's get going. We're already 10 minutes into the official start time. So the basic instructions. It's going to cover, this midterm has questions that cover chapters 15 through 21. They're pretty simple questions, pretty straightforward questions. Everyone has seen these questions already, at least I hope you have. They're directly sourced from the questions featured at the end of each chapter. And I just basically chose questions at random. So that's kind of the surprise element of this exam, is I am the one who chose the questions. And these aren't hard-hitting questions. These aren't the most difficult questions, I think, by a long shot. I could have chosen many more questions that were significantly more difficult. But they are questions that do require you to really think about your answer and to think like historians, and that's the whole point of this exam. Oh, hello, welcome. And we're just getting started, so feel free to join right in. We're just going through the instructions. The exam is going to be, of course, open book and open note. There's no other way for me to conduct an essay exam like this, because I can't stop you from using your book, especially in an online course. It's not like an in-class course where where basically you can monitor the way students are taking the exam. So it's completely open book. As far as length, and this is probably the most common question I've received from students with regards to our midterm, the answer is it should be about the length of a sheet of printer paper. 8.5 by 11 sheet, about 1.5 sheets basically. Okay, so it shouldn't be terribly long. Okay, I'm looking for a basic answer. If you go 2 pages, that's fine. I mean, I don't want you to write beyond. I would say the maximum length I would expect for a single question would probably be 3 pages if it was handwritten. I don't want extensive answers, and part of being a good historian is to be able to refine your answers in a very concise manner. So without further ado, any questions before we get started? Does anybody have any questions? No, I don't see anybody typing, so let's just get going, because I know you guys are probably short on time, and I don't want to keep you guys any longer past 5. So let's just get on to question 1. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each question. And, and by the way this exam works is from this list of 10 questions, you're just to choose one of them. And that's it. That's your midterm. Very simple, very straightforward. I like to keep things very simple, very clean. So there's no general fuss. But basically, I'm going to go through each of these questions and just give you guys a very basic outline, just to provide some sort of foundation for what I'm expecting, what kind of answer I'm expecting. And you can write your essay however you like. I do expect somewhat of a thesis in your papers. I would look at your answer as an early rough draft of a paper that you would submit, a formal research paper. I don't expect clean, absolutely clean and polished papers. I don't expect people to be using citations from other sources. This is supposed to be mimicking an in-class midterm essay exam, where you wouldn't have those kind of resources at your disposal. Those aren't available, and you're supposed to basically rely on your memory for the most part, and it's supposed to mimic that in the best way possible. But I will give you guys a foundation as to what kind of answers I'm expecting, what kind of just the basics. And you can add to it if you find while you're answering your question, you're curious about whether or not you should add this component to it. You can feel free to email me and I'll answer. If I think that what you want to incorporate is good, go ahead and add it. If I think you're digressing from the what the question is asking, I'll tell you that too. So let's get on to the first question. Question 1. How did black families, churches, schools, and other institutions contribute to the development of African American culture and political activism in this period? Now, with each question, I'm also including which chapter this question is sourced from, so you know exactly which chapter it'll focus on. Although you can pull information, for example, from, say, chapter 16, or if you have volume 1 of the Foner book, chapter 14, because all this information, there's a lot of overlap, okay? So you can do that. I do invite students that have taken History 201 to do that. So for this question in particular, there are a few points I do want you guys to focus in on. The first is the expansion and the strength of free black churches and schools after the war. Many institutions also focus on how these institutions were founded under slavery. That might be something you want to focus in on. And also the strength of the family in post-war African American life. We discussed this in lecture. If you remember, this was in our chapter 15 slides. It was about the 4th slide in. You might want to discuss how African Americans really made efforts to try to find loved ones that had been separated due to sale or by any other other means. You might want to talk about how widows of black soldiers were trying to fight the federal government to obtain pensions. And also the construction of family life. You might want to talk about that too. The separate spheres of free families, where you had more women, rather than spending time in fields, spending more time at home and raising families, and men seeking work outside of the home. You also might want to talk about how the strength of the church became a center of the community, not just for religious aspects, but also for education, also social, and also political parts of the the growing free African American community. I wouldn't focus on how this would have an impact, and these are the chapters that we're currently working on this week, and I'll post those lectures probably tonight or tomorrow. I do want to give you guys time to work on your midterms. But I will be talking about the civil rights movement and the basically rose out of the African American churches with Dr. King as at the helm, and other religious leaders from the South as well. We'll be talking about that, but you don't need to focus in on that. Just stick to this period, this post-war period, and I think you'll be okay. Also, I would discuss how newly freed slaves sought to educate themselves, and specifically learning how to read, so they themselves can read the Bible. And also the founding of the first black colleges too. I would also discuss that, and if you want, talk about. Although you don't have to use very, very specific examples, and I wouldn't focus too much on the specific African American congressmen, because there were many at this point in time for a short while. Remember, we talked about that until the rise of the Redeemer movement. You can talk about that, but I would focus on the other aspects, especially the rise of African American communities, focusing around church and education and the family. I would focus more on that. Okay, any questions before I move on? Okay, give you guys about a minute or so to think about it. No questions? Feel free. You can use the chat box right below if you really want to ask any questions, and I'll answer them as pertaining to this question. If not, I'll move on, just because we have got quite a few questions. We have got 9 more questions to get through, so I'm going to go through this rather quickly. And again, if you have any questions after the session, feel free to email me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. My apologies. Sometimes I get so many emails from students with a variety of different questions on different aspects, from just clarification to any other matter pertaining to the class. So if your question slips through the cracks, my apologies, and just ask me again, and I'll get back to you. With that digression, sorry about that. Let's get on to question 2 then. What caused the confrontation between President Johnson and Congress over Reconstruction? Now, if you recall, this was in reference to how the South should be rebuilt after the war. Now, this is a very specific subject with regards to Reconstruction, to what historians call 2 different types of Reconstruction. We want to focus on really the pardons that were taking place soon after the war, really kind of restoring political and property rights to white Southerners who took the oath of allegiance, which excluded Confederate leaders and wealthy planters, because remember, there were certain guidelines they had to meet. But there were also many who were exempted. So any wealthy planters or leaders of the Confederates that had land and holdings more than $20,000, there are many who were exempt from taking this oath and to the United States. Also, Congress was angered when Johnson appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions, which were all elected, of course, by local prominent whites to establish new state governments. Within these new state governments, they were to abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and to refuse to pay Confederate debts. But the main issue was this restoring of the old guard, the restoring of the power of the Confederacy, basically the structure to basically to pre-war conditions. And by the end of 1865, I would also talk about how radical Republicans, by December specifically that year, well, let's see. Would I include that? Sorry, I'm looking over my own notes. You could talk about. I mean, you could talk about how with the problem with radical Republicans in Congress and how they tried to go around Johnson's policies. You can talk about that too, and you can talk about the work, the efforts by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. I would mostly focus in on that. You can, which is kind of as a starting point. Also, the problems that, and specifically leading up to basically Johnson trying to remove cabinet members without the Senate's consent, specifically the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And I would talk about that. That would really kind of sum up your essay with that. Any questions? I pretty much went a little bit overboard on that one. There's no really way to lay a foundation without really going through the different aspects of that essay. Okay, no questions so far? Feel free to write in the bottom, and I'll get back and I'll ask, and I'll answer them as soon as you ask them. No? Okay, let's move on. We've got a lot to get through. Excuse me. Question 3: Why were railroads so important to America's second industrial revolution? What events demonstrate their influence on society and politics as well as the economy? Well, we need to look at railroads in terms of the rising industries specifically that developed after the Civil War. Specifically, we see this in steel. We see this also in cotton, which existed prior to the war. But we also see this in oil, the rise of the Rockefeller, the rise of Carnegie, and what profound influence they had over, with their massive wealth, what profound influence did they have over local economies? Remember, we talked about the horizontal integration and also the vertical integration. You might want to consider that, especially with regards to railroads, and how the impact of also the rise of the railroad barons as well. You might want to talk about that too. How that impacted prices, how that shaped pricing and farming for local farmers, for example, by opening up markets far and wide outside of their local markets. That allowed them to do that. But you also might want to talk about price gouging, huge freight rates, and of course with pricing control exerted on railroads by the big railroad, the oil barons, Rockefeller and Carnegie, and how they played a profound influence. With regards to political affairs, how that shaped unionization, the impact of basically of railroads and how they developed in terms of spread. You can even talk about how it spread west, the growth of the number of transcontinental lines after the Civil War. You can discuss that and how that impacted people moving west. Also the rise of communities centered around the railroad. You might want to focus in on that as well. Let's see, what else would we want to talk about? I would also talk about, let's see here, there's one other aspect I want. Let me take a look here. Let's see, my notes. Excuse me. Let's see. I think that pretty much. You might want to also talk about perhaps the impact on Native Americans too. You could incorporate that as well. Let's see. You could talk about the Crédit Mobilier scandal. You could talk about that because that was the corporation formed by the Union Pacific Railroad stockholders to make contracts with itself. Let's see, you might want to talk about, yeah, I mean, that would probably be it with regards to the railroad's impact politically. You can also discuss the rising tide of labor, the immigration, with regards specifically to immigration. You can talk about the California railroads and how that impacted California politics, the rise of immigrant groups, and discrimination against those groups like the Chinese. So there's a lot of different ways you could take this essay, and a lot of different aspects. Even from a social point of view, basically the connection of California to the Eastern Seaboard, thanks to the rise of Reconstruction. You could talk about the closing of the West as well. Incorporate that, although that might be a little bit of a digression. I wouldn't mind that. Are there any questions on this? Sorry, I kind of went through a lot of different areas with this particular essay, but this is probably one of the more flexible questions, I think. There's a lot of different areas we can chime into. Are there any questions? I saw one. Okay, I think we're good. Let's move on to question 4. I think everything's pretty good here. And this is kind of tying into question 3 a little bit. And you can answer this in kind of the same way using some aspects. According to The Gilded Age by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, the era slogan was, "Get rich dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must." Explain how this was true of the politics of the era. Again, you can talk about the Crédit Mobilier. Excuse me, my French is pretty bad. You talk about that scandal. You can talk about even the greenback issue, and also the issue of the whole issue, especially in the 1896 and 1900 election, between silver and gold. That whole issue with Williams Jennings Bryan, if you recall, and that you might want to talk about that. You also might want to talk about, what it meant to be. What was the Gilded Age? Why called it gilded? Because remember, that idea of something that is gilded is very deceptive. Okay, it's the idea that yes, there's this nice golden front, but underneath that golden facade lies a core of very little value, right? You know, like kind of something that gilded. A more modern way is like if something is gold-plated, if you want to call it that. Gilding is another word for. I guess my metallurgy knowledge is very limited. I'm assuming that gilding is akin to plating, although somebody might want to correct me on that. It's been a while since I've taken chemistry. So, but basically you get the idea. If something's plated, it doesn't necessarily mean the core of whatever that plated item is worth anything. And that's kind of representation of that quote, basically, and the means of getting those riches. And you might want to discuss that. Again, talk about the Crédit Mobilier scandal, and talk about, you can even talk about the whiskey ring, for example, in the Grant administration. You can even discuss that. the rise of political machines like the Tweed Ring in New York under Boss Tweed, William Tweed, which robbed the city of millions and millions of dollars. You can talk about how new railroad corporations wielded great influence, basically in terms of providing stock and also other benefits to legislatures. You can even use that part in the previous question too, but yeah, basically that would pretty much cover it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Okay, any questions on this one? No? No? Okay. I don't see anybody typing anything, so let's just move on. Okay, we're a little bit behind. As I was hoping to about 3 or so minutes behind, but that's okay. We'll be fine. And if you have any questions about any other questions, well, I'll take questions at the end. So if you think of one during this session, just feel free to chime in. That's perfectly fine. And use the under the chat window, use the room tab. That way, everyone can see your questions. And also you can contribute to my answer if you so wish. So let's move on to question 5. Explain how the changes in politics, economics, social factors, and spread of violence affected the situation for blacks in the New South. It's important to discuss the rise of the Redeemer movement, the rise of the lost cause philosophy in the New South. That would strip away rights for African Americans, especially after Reconstruction ended. And I would really focus in on that. You can talk about, for example, the introduction of black codes and also the beginnings of Jim Crow. But I think you see a greater impact after Reconstruction, because remember, as Bonner indicated, after Reconstruction closed and after the Freedmen's Bureau was pretty much shut down and local politics was pretty much put back into the hands of former Confederate leaders, and we basically see the stripping away of rights of African Americans. We see the rise of poll taxes, for example, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests preventing African Americans from being able to vote. Economic opportunities went from bad to worse as more and more African Americans were basically forced into basically what eventually became the sharecropping system. Threats to violence, which we remember that whole lecture on the number of individuals lynched during this period, and it wasn't just random lynching. It was over. It could have been something that was very innocent. Also, vagrancy laws, but the main focus, of course, in terms of violence, of course, was lynching. You know, if the way a black man looked at a white woman, they could be lynched for that. It could be any reason. And as Bonner points out, it was really on the whim of the white community, and it made the lives of African Americans in the South miserable. Will be an understatement. Okay, so I would focus on those areas in answering this question, and I think you should be good. Any other questions? No? Also, if you want to talk about more, maybe positive aspects in terms of African Americans, you could discuss the rise of African American communities as well in this chapter, and I think that would really add to your answer. Amidst all these other negative factors, it was a very bad period, and I wouldn't go so far as to talk about the Great Migration yet, because remember there was a migration soon after the Civil War, But remember, that migration didn't really take place until about World War I and mostly after World War I. With the rise of communities in Detroit, Chicago, and in New York. But I would stay away from that aspect of it, of answering this question. Because remember, we're just talking about the South, the New South. And remember, New South means post-war South, the rebuilt South. Question 6. What ideas and interests motivated the United States to create an empire in the 19th century? I would focus on basically the competition that the United States was having between the rising European empires and the United States' desire to basically get a piece of the action, if you want to call it that. You could talk about the Monroe Doctrine, which was expanded with the Roosevelt Corollary. You could talk about that. You can also discuss the war against the Spanish and the use of newspapers through yellow journalism to amplify that war. You could talk about the Philippines and the United States' basically conquering of the Philippines and of Cuba, and the negotiations between, to allow Cuba to remain independent in a way. You can also talk about the Panama Canal too. Those are areas I would talk about. So you can talk about the economic interests. You can incorporate parts of the the white man's burden philosophy. You can talk about that too, with among other racial overtones, to try to justify what is basically American imperialism at this point in time. Okay? So we got about 20 more minutes, and we only have about 4 more questions. I wanted to leave a period of time for you guys to ask any questions. Anything so far? No? We're good? Okay, I'm going to assume you guys are good. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. Feel free to write your questions in the chat box below, okay? And again, if not, feel free to, you can ask during the Q&A portion of this review or in the next couple of days, okay? Question 7, describe how Fordism transformed American industrial and consumer society. I would discuss, with regards to this chapter, Ford's view on Americanism. I would really focus in, you can focus in on how he used his philosophies for loyalty, and American loyalty specifically. Let's see here. Let me find what the name. There was a name that he incorporated within his own factories. Which, let's see, I can't find the name of it, but I would talk about the rise of his factories, the rise of the loyalty among his workers. And you can talk about that also. You can talk about, this is a very open answer, but I mean the specific answer though of Fordism. Fordism is what was basically the mass production and mass consumption that resulted from his advancements to the assembly line in his Michigan manufacturing plants. The rise of also his belief that you need to pay your workers a higher wage, which attracted tremendous number of skilled workers, which also even added to his prevented unionization from taking place. But also, like I said, tying back into that notion that you wanted loyal workers. You wanted workers who were going to learn English. So he had classes to support these workers too. So you kind of create kind of a an occupational culture, if you will. And that's really what Fordism was. And so you're kind of molding Americans, and you're paying them well so that they could buy the goods that they're creating. So again, mass production and mass consumption system. So I think that pretty much would cover that pretty well. And it was a reflection on the growing society, the society leading up to the First World War. The idea is that the worker could now have a piece of the pie. You could have goods. You could afford to buy a telephone. You could afford to buy a car. These weren't just items that were relegated to the upper classes. Okay, with the Model T, with the introduction of Model T, that was probably the greatest example of a utilitarian consumer good that could be afforded by the average Joe. Okay, let's see here. We've got about 3 more questions. I think that pretty much covers that. I think he gave you way more than a foundation on that question. Any questions before I go on? No? I don't see anybody type. Oh, here we go. We have somebody typing. So, no. Okay, well, I guess not. Okay, again, feel free to ask any questions as we go along. You can even ask about previous questions. Okay, so don't think because we're on question 8 that you can't ask about question 3 or what have you. Okay, feel free to ask. Question 8, what are the governmental and private examples of coercive patriotism during the war, and what were the effects of those efforts? Okay, now we're going to be talking about specifically the efforts to basically make it illegal to criticize the government. And this was done, criticize the government specifically in the involvement of the war. Many states at this point in time imprisoned anyone who criticized the American flag, who had the flags of communism and anarchism, the red and black flags. There is even, basically, we see the rise of culture where patriotism was synonymous with support for the government, for the war, for our economic system, and anything against that was anti-American. It was any anti-war sentiments, any radicalism. You weren't seen as American. You weren't contributing to the effort. People who didn't buy Liberty bonds were sometimes investigated. Teachers and other administrators in schools were required to sign loyalty oaths. You had slacker raids carried out in cities where many men were forced to produce their draft cards. Okay, it was a very there was an atmosphere during the war of very strong leadership, strong patriotism. You can even say almost a jingoistic patriotism, if you will. Extreme patriotism, almost borderlining violence in a way. And somewhat racism too, because remember, there's a tremendous amount of anti-German sentiment too. You can even discuss that. You can talk about also the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 with regards to spoken or written statements. with regards to the government's war effort. You could talk about how they charged using those laws more than 2,000 people, especially as most prominently Eugene V. Debs, the socialist leader who ran for president while in the 1920 election while from prison and received over nearly 1 million votes. We talked about that. And that's really what I would focus in on. It's just that atmosphere and that rise of the that ultra-patriotic culture. Okay? And also the deportation of certain individuals too at this point in time. Okay? So, okay, so we move on. I think that pretty much covers that. Okay, let's move on. I don't think anyone has any questions. Again, don't be shy. It's okay. If you don't want to answer any questions, if you just want to email me with your question, that's fine too. But don't be shy. Feel free. No one will criticize you. Question 9, identify the causes of the Great Depression. Now, the answer I'm not looking for with regards to the Great Depression is simply the stock market crash. Okay? That's not really, you could say that was the, you could say that was the illness to the economy. You can call that the illness, but it was not a symptom of the economy. They weren't, or symptoms. Okay? We need to go back through the decade. Okay? We need to look, for example, at different aspects of the economy that were failing throughout the so-called era of prosperity, the 1920s, the roaring 20s. In some areas, they were not so roaring. Okay? The real estate booms and busts in Southern California and Florida. Okay? That resulted in a lot of failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. We need to talk about the how farming was affected during the 1920s. The rise of the Dust Bowl, that would take place in the 1930s. Well, it just didn't happen because of the Dust Bowl didn't take place because of the stock market crash. It was already going on throughout the 20s. We saw incomes reduce among American farmers because now there was the food they were growing, there was no longer demand. Prices plummeted after the war, basically reducing their purchasing power. You saw a lot of farms being foreclosed. It's important to know how the sale of automobiles and also household consumer goods really stagnated after 1926. And the European demand for these goods also declined. We have to also look at the stock market bubble that was created with speculation and buying on credit. Basically banks that were using basically people's savings to buy stocks that would sometimes go under. They would completely bottom out. And there was no mechanisms in place, no fail-safe mechanisms. Okay? So that's really important to understand. And we have to look at the number of businesses that would, even after the stock market crash, the number of businesses that failed, for example, in 1930. Okay, and also, we should look at not just the effect of the United States, we saw how the economic downturn was affected internationally. You know, Germany, for example, no longer could pay anything on their reparation payments to France and Britain, who in turn couldn't repay their debts to us, the United States. Also we should look at how many banks failed, many people withdrew money from their banks and millions lost their savings. So we should really look at those various aspects. Not saying what I do not want anyone saying is basically the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash in 1929. That's not That won't be an acceptable answer. That will not be considered. If you put that, it won't get an A on your paper. I'll put it that way. But we want to talk about those various other aspects. Again, I want you guys starting to think like historians. Not any one thing could be traced to any one specific event. The Great Depression can't be traced to any single event like the stock market crash. Okay? Does that answer that question? Yes, no, kind of? Okay, I see some people typing. You can say that the stock market crash was in part of the problem, but it's more the illness and not the symptoms leading up to the illness. Okay, the stock market crash was the flu, but you can think of all the failures throughout the 1920s that are building up to that crash as being kind of the few days leading up to the flu, the coughing and the headaches and things like that. Think of it in those terms, and also afterwards too. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I mean the stock market crash was one of the problems, of course, devastating our economy, but it certainly there are many other aspects leading up to the Great Depression. Well, looks like we have another question too. Let's see. I'll wait for it before we get on to question 10. Okay. Yes, we want basically to identify the events leading up to the sickness. We definitely want to do that. Thank you, Alex, for pointing that out. Yes, that's basically what we want. The causes of the depression. Okay. And I'm not trying to say that the stock market crash wasn't a cause specifically, but the misconception is that the Great Depression was caused by the crash, and that's not the case, as we read in Foner and as we discussed in lecture. So we're running short on time, so let's just get straight to question 10, and then we'll give you guys a few minutes to ask me any questions. Question 10, what actions did President Roosevelt and Congress take to help the banking system recover, as well as to reform how it operated in the long run? Remember, we talked about this in the 100 days, the first 100 days of Roosevelt's tenure in office. Some of the first things he did was to basically restore faith in the banking system. And that's very important to understand what Roosevelt did with regards to the banks. We have to first talk about one of the first steps, things he did in office, was to declare a bank holiday, halting of all bank operations, and called a special session in Congress, who in turn, he pretty much pressured them to pass the Emergency Banking Act to provide funds to the endangered acts. We need to talk about, with regards to, you would talk about the Glass-Steagall Act, which barred commercial banks from doing, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, buying and selling stocks, basically using people's money. We need to talk about the establishment of Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which is still very much with us today, basically insuring the accounts of individual depositors. You probably hear that in commercials. This bank is FDIC insured or something like that. What they mean is basically your money is safe. Each account is insured for up to $100,000. You should also talk about Roosevelt's taking the United States off the gold standard, basically tying our currency into with gold reserves, basically making it possible to issue more paper money and really stimulate business activity. And you want to talk about the rising control that the federal government had basically overall on the banking industry and how this really would impact the relationship that the government had with our financial institutions. It's important to note that between 1929 and 1933, 5,000 banks failed. Basically, a full third of the total banks in our country, as Foner mentioned, but not one bank failed in 1936 because of these efforts, and that's really important to understand. And I think that pretty much, I'm just looking if there's anything else in my notes I wanted to talk about. No, I think that pretty much covers on that. Pretty much covers everything in that particular question that I wanted to cover. And I think that's about it. So, are there any questions? Are there any questions on any of these questions? So I'll give you guys a few minutes, the last 2 minutes of this session. Well, I just want to thank also, while you guys are asking any questions, I just want to thank you guys for participating in this session. I don't know if anyone had experienced any technical difficulties, but hopefully everything went pretty smooth for all of you. I look forward to your answers, your midterm exams, and I think you're all. I mean, I'm sure they're going to be just as good as all the posts, all the forum posts that I've been reading, which have been fantastic. I've been loving seeing all these different conversations taking place. I've read through the majority of them. I still have to read through quite a few because you have to remember I have quite a few students to read whose posts I have to read through for every chapter. So it takes some time. But I'm really loving the engagement between students and the respect in the answers that I'm seeing. They're fantastic. Well, are there any questions? We've got about 30 more seconds or so. But if not, I hope you guys do well. Hope you, again, if you have any questions. Oh, we've got a question coming up. Well, I'm glad you guys liked this session. I'm really glad. Again, please let me know if there's anything you want me to cover. Feel free to email me next couple of days. Obviously, don't email me after the last day to turn in your midterm with your question. Just the next couple of days, if you have any questions, just feel free to email me. I won't be going through drafts, by the way, of your papers. That's just, unfortunately, I just don't have time to do something like that. Again, this is supposed to be just a rough draft. You're supposed to have, obviously, it's supposed to be an essay format, but remember, it's a rough draft, okay? I don't expect a fully polished essay here. So, without further ado, I think that pretty much concludes this session. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay? You guys have been great. Thanks. Have a great evening, guys. And I'll be posting our lectures for this week later on, probably the first one tonight, but I do want you guys to be focusing on your midterms. All right. Take care, guys.